Sometimes fate does not knock. Sometimes it leaves a scratch across your car and waits for you to recognize the person standing on the other side. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe some meetings are written long before they happen, like this story and subscribe. Now, back to the story. The rain had just begun to fall over downtown Portland. It was the kind of soft rain that blurred traffic lights into warm streaks across the windshield. Daniel Brooks loosened his grip on the steering wheel as another long workday finally came to an end. The radio played quietly, but he barely noticed. His mind was still trapped inside unfinished meetings, unanswered emails, and a life that looked successful from the outside, but strangely empty once the front door closed every evening. The line of cars ahead slowed without warning. Daniel reached for the brake. A dull tap echoed through the wet afternoon. Not loud, not violent, just enough to make his heartbeat pause. His sedan had gently bumped the rear bumper of the silver SUV in front of him. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Of all the careless mistakes he had managed to avoid for years, today had chosen this one. Traffic moved around them as both vehicles pulled safely onto the shoulder. Rain collected along the edge of the road, carrying tiny leaves into the storm drain. Daniel stepped outside, adjusting his jacket against the cool air. His first thought was simple. Check the damage. Exchange insurance information. Apologize. Move on. The driver's door of the SUV slowly opened. A woman stepped out. She brushed a strand of blonde hair behind her ear before looking toward him. Daniel stopped walking. His breathing disappeared. Emily Harper. For a moment the city seemed to lose every sound it had. The passing buses, the horns, the rain. Everything faded behind the impossible reality standing less than 20 feet away. She looked older than the woman in his memories, but only in the quiet ways life changes people. Her face carried confidence where uncertainty once lived. Her eyes remained the same soft green he remembered from another lifetime. Emily recognized him almost immediately. Her steps slowed. Neither of them spoke. Years of silence settled between them more heavily than the thin rain falling across the street. Daniel glanced toward the small scratch on her bumper. It suddenly felt meaningless. Emily followed his eyes before looking back at him. Her lips parted slightly, as if 1,000 forgotten conversations had rushed forward at once, only to stop before becoming words. Neither anger nor bitterness appeared on her face. Only surprise. Only disbelief. Only the strange expression of someone meeting a chapter she believed had already ended. Daniel finally found enough breath to speak. I am sorry. The apology sounded far too small for everything that stood between them. Emily lowered her eyes for a brief second, then looked back at him with a calmness he had never seen during the final months of their marriage. She gave a gentle nod. It is only a scratch. But Daniel suddenly realized the scratch on the bumper was not the accident fate had been waiting for. Some encounters begin with a collision. The ones that change your life begin with the silence that follows. Rain continued to fall in gentle waves, tapping against the roofs of the two motionless vehicles. Drivers passed by without giving the accident a second glance. To everyone else, it was nothing more than a minor traffic delay. To Daniel Brooks and Emily Harper, it felt as though time itself had stepped onto the shoulder of the road and quietly refused to move. Daniel looked down at the faint scratch running across the silver bumper. It was barely visible beneath the thin layer of rainwater. I'll take care of the repair, he said softly. Emily nodded without hesitation. I'm sure it won't be much. The conversation ended almost as soon as it began. Years ago, they could spend hours talking about nothing at all. Now even complete sentences seemed strangely difficult to assemble. Neither of them reached for their phones immediately. Neither hurried to exchange insurance cards. Instead, they simply stood there beneath the gray afternoon sky, separated by only a few feet in an entire lifetime. The scent of wet asphalt mixed with the cool breeze drifting through the busy intersection. Somewhere nearby, a traffic signal clicked through another cycle. A city bus hissed to a stop before disappearing into the rain again. Emily folded her arms, not because she was upset, but because the air had grown colder. Daniel noticed the familiar gesture. She had always done that whenever she felt uncomfortable. He remembered offering her his jacket once during an autumn festival many years before. She had laughed and insisted she was fine before quietly putting it on anyway. The memory arrived without permission. He pushed it away. This weather wasn't in the forecast, he finally said. Emily glanced toward the cloudy sky. It rarely is. A faint smile appeared on both of their faces before disappearing just as quickly. The silence that followed no longer felt awkward. It felt careful, as though both of them understood that one careless word might reopen wounds neither had spent years trying to heal. Daniel reached into his wallet and handed her his insurance card. Their fingers almost touched. Almost. Emily accepted the card with a polite nod. Thank you. Her voice carried the same gentle warmth he remembered, only quieter now, shaped by years he had not witnessed. She seemed peaceful, not because life had been easy, because she had learned how to carry difficult things without allowing them to become visible. Daniel found himself wondering how many mornings, birthdays, holidays, and ordinary Tuesdays had passed without him knowing anything about her life. He realized he no longer knew where she lived, whether she still painted on weekends, whether she still preferred tea over coffee, whether someone else now knew all the little things he once believed only he would remember. A police cruiser slowly pulled onto the shoulder behind them, its flashing lights reflecting softly across the wet pavement. The officer stepped out with an easy smile, immediately recognizing that no one had been injured. It looks like everyone is all right, he said. Daniel nodded. Yes, officer. Just a small accident. The officer began documenting the scene while asking routine questions. Daniel answered automatically, but his attention drifted back toward Emily. She stood quietly beside her SUV, watching raindrops slide across the windshield. For a brief moment, she looked exactly as she had years ago whenever she was lost in thought. Not angry, not sad, simply somewhere far away. Daniel suddenly understood something that surprised him. The hardest part of seeing Emily again was not remembering the woman he had loved. It was realizing how much of her life had continued beautifully without him. Some photographs survive because paper lasts. Others survive because the heart never truly lets them go. The police officer finished writing the final notes on his report before handing both of them a copy. Everything looks straightforward, he said with an easy smile. No injuries. Just contact your insurance companies, and you should be all set. Daniel thanked him. Emily offered the same quiet politeness she had shown since stepping out of her vehicle. The officer returned to his cruiser, and within moments the flashing lights disappeared into the steady flow of afternoon traffic. For the first time since the accident, they were completely alone. Rain had become lighter now, drifting through the cool air almost like mist. Daniel opened the trunk of his sedan to retrieve a folder containing his insurance paperwork. He reached inside, moving aside an old roadside emergency kit and a folded blanket he rarely used. As he lifted the blue folder, something slipped free. A single photograph fluttered downward. It landed face up on the wet pavement. Neither of them moved immediately. Emily looked down first. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Daniel followed her gaze. The photograph had faded slightly with age, but its colors were still warm enough to preserve the afternoon it had captured. Two smiling faces stood beside a quiet lake surrounded by autumn trees. Daniel wore a flannel jacket. Emily leaned comfortably against his shoulder, laughing at something outside the frame. Neither of them had been looking at the camera. It had always been one of Daniel's favorite photographs because it captured happiness before either of them realized it would someday become a memory. He slowly bent down and picked it up. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't know this was still in there. Emily looked at the photograph for another moment before answering. I remember that trip. Her voice carried no sadness, only recognition. We got lost for almost 2 hours. Daniel gave a small laugh, and we refused to admit the map was upside down. Emily smiled. For at least 30 minutes. The laughter disappeared almost as gently as it had arrived. Neither of them mentioned that it had been their last vacation together before life became too busy, too complicated, too quiet. Daniel looked at the worn edges of the photograph. I thought I had cleaned everything out after. He stopped himself. After the divorce. The words remained unspoken. Emily understood anyway. There are always things we forget, she replied. Daniel carefully slipped the photograph back into the folder. For years he had believed he had packed away every reminder of their marriage. Apparently, memory had been more patient than he was. The rain finally stopped. Clouds slowly parted above the city, allowing pale sunlight to reflect across the wet pavement. Emily looked toward her SUV. I should probably call the repair shop. Daniel nodded. I know a good one nearby. She hesitated. Still the same place? Same owner. Emily smiled faintly. Some things really don't change. Daniel almost answered. Instead, he simply nodded. The silence between them no longer felt like strangers standing together. It felt like two people carefully walking through the remains of a house they had once built together. Nothing was exactly where they remembered, yet every room still carried echoes. Daniel watched Emily for a moment as she slipped her phone back into her coat pocket without making the call. He realized neither of them seemed eager to leave. Not because of the damaged cars, because fate had quietly given them something neither of them had expected. Time. Just enough time to look at the past without running from it. Sometimes the longest journey is only a few miles, especially when every street remembers who you used to be. Daniel glanced at the small scratch one last time before closing the folder that held his insurance documents. There's a repair shop about 10 minutes from here, he said. They've done good work for years. Emily looked toward her SUV, then back at him. I've heard of it. They can probably look at it today. She hesitated, her fingers resting lightly against the roof of her vehicle. I've never been very good at finding garages. Daniel almost smiled. You used to say every mechanic sounded like they were speaking another language. I probably still would. The familiar rhythm of their conversation surprised them both. It wasn't effortless, but neither was it forced. It sounded like two people rediscovering a language they had once spoken every day. Emily glanced at the cloudy sky. If it's not too much trouble, I could follow you. Daniel nodded. Of course. Within minutes, both vehicles eased back into traffic. Daniel drove ahead, checking his rearview mirror more often than necessary. The silver SUV remained behind him at every light, every turn, every stop sign. The drive should have felt ordinary. Instead, every familiar street carried memories hidden beneath fresh layers of asphalt. They passed the bookstore where they had spent rainy Saturday afternoons before buying more novels than either of them had time to read. They crossed the small bridge where Daniel had once stopped the car just to watch the river covered in autumn leaves. Neither of them mentioned any of it. The city remembered quietly enough. At a red light, Daniel looked into the mirror again. Emily was there, one hand resting on the steering wheel, her expression calm as soft afternoon light slipped through her windshield. Years earlier, that same reflection had greeted him almost every morning as they drove to work together. He had never imagined a simple traffic light could hold so many versions of the past. The light turned green. The cars continued forward. 10 minutes later, they arrived at the repair shop. A weathered wooden sign hung above the entrance exactly as Daniel remembered. The owner, an older man named Frank, stepped outside wiping his hands with a clean shop towel. Daniel, Frank said with a broad smile. Haven't seen you in a while. It's been too long. Frank examined the small scratch before nodding. This won't take much. Emily stepped closer while Frank carefully inspected the bumper. Honestly, he said, it's mostly surface paint. We can polish most of this out. Emily let out a quiet breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That's good news. Frank smiled kindly. Give me about 30 minutes. He disappeared inside the garage. The heavy door rolled shut with a deep mechanical sound. Suddenly, Daniel and Emily found themselves standing alone once again. Across the street sat a small neighborhood cafe. Its windows glowed with warm amber light despite the gray afternoon. Daniel noticed it first. They make good coffee. Emily followed his gaze. I remember. He looked at her, slightly surprised. We stopped there once, she said. After looking at apartments. Daniel searched his memory. Then it returned. Their first apartment. The tiny kitchen. The second-hand dining table they had assembled together while laughing over missing screws. He smiled before he could stop himself. So we did. Emily tucked her hands into the pockets of her coat. We have 30 minutes. Daniel looked from the cafe back to her. Neither of them suggested talking about the past. Neither promised answers. It was only coffee. Only 30 minutes. Yet somehow, both of them sensed that the conversation waiting beyond those cafe doors might become far more important than the accident that had brought them there. Sometimes healing does not begin with forgiveness. Sometimes it begins with 2 cups of coffee growing cold between people who finally stop pretending they have nothing left to say. The little cafe had not changed much over the years. The wooden floor still creaked beneath every step. The windows were still framed with hanging plants that collected tiny drops of rain. Fresh coffee filled the room with the familiar warmth that seemed capable of slowing the outside world. Daniel held the door open. Emily smiled politely as she walked inside. Thank you. He nodded. The words felt ordinary, yet strangely precious. They chose a quiet table near the window. Outside, Frank's repair shop stood across the street, its garage door still closed while mechanics worked inside. They had 30 minutes. Perhaps less. A young waitress approached with an easy smile. What can I get for you? Emily glanced at the menu before quietly laughing. I don't even need to look. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You still order the same thing? She looked up. A vanilla latte. He smiled. And an extra shot of espresso. Emily blinked with mild surprise. You remember. I remembered more than I realized. The waitress turned toward Daniel. And for you. Black coffee. Emily looked at him. No cream anymore? Daniel chuckled softly. I suppose people change. The waitress disappeared toward the counter, leaving another comfortable silence behind. Neither rushed to fill it. Outside, rainwater slid slowly down the cafe window, turning passing cars into soft reflections. Emily folded her hands around the warm ceramic cup after the drinks arrived. For a while, they simply watched the steam rise. Finally, Daniel spoke. So, Emily looked at him. So, they laughed quietly at the awkwardness. I wasn't expecting today, Daniel admitted. I don't think either of us was. Another pause. Not uncomfortable. Just careful. Daniel looked toward the window before asking the question that had been sitting quietly in his thoughts since the accident. Are you happy? Emily did not answer immediately. She watched a little girl outside jump over a puddle while holding her mother's hand. Then she smiled. I think happiness looks different now. Daniel listened. When we were younger, she continued, I thought happiness meant everything had to be perfect. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Now I think it means sleeping peacefully. Daniel lowered his eyes. That sounds healthier. It probably is. She looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn all afternoon. And you? Daniel exhaled slowly. I've done well at work. She nodded. I heard. He looked surprised. You heard? Portland isn't that big. A faint smile crossed her face. I've seen your company's name in the news. Daniel laughed softly. They usually only write about the good days. Emily tilted her head slightly. And the bad ones. They're quieter. For a brief moment, they simply looked at each other. Not as former spouses. Not as strangers. Just as two people who finally understood that success and peace were never the same thing. Daniel traced the rim of his coffee cup with one finger. There was a time I thought working harder would fix everything. Emily's eyes remained gentle. I know. You tried to tell me. I did. He nodded slowly. I just wasn't listening. Emily looked back toward the rain-streaked window. Neither accusation nor regret appeared in her voice when she finally spoke. Sometimes people don't stop loving each other. She paused, watching another drop of rain slide down the glass. They simply stop hearing each other. Daniel felt those words settle quietly somewhere deep inside him. Not like blame, like truth. Across the street, the garage door began to rise. Their 30 minutes were almost over. Neither of them realized that the conversation they had just shared was far more valuable than repairing a scratch bumper. Without knowing it, they had begun repairing something far older. The hardest truths are rarely spoken in anger. They are whispered after both hearts have grown tired of carrying them alone. The cafe door closed softly behind them as they stepped back onto the sidewalk. The rain had completely stopped. Fresh sunlight broke through the retreating clouds, leaving tiny diamonds of water glistening across the pavement. The city looked washed clean, as though the afternoon itself had decided to begin again. Across the street, Frank waved from the garage entrance. Your SUV is ready. Emily smiled and thanked him as they crossed the road together. Frank wiped the repaired bumper with a clean cloth before stepping aside. There you go, he said proudly. Good as new. Emily ran her fingertips lightly across the surface. The scratch had almost disappeared. You can barely tell it was ever there. Frank chuckled. Sometimes small marks polish out easier than we expect. Daniel looked at the bumper. For reasons he couldn't explain, the sentence felt as though it had never been about the car. Frank returned inside to prepare the invoice, leaving them alone once more beneath the quiet afternoon sky. Emily rested one hand on the driver's door, but didn't open it. Instead, she looked toward the rows of maple trees lining the street. I used to think our divorce happened because we stopped loving each other. Daniel remained silent. I don't believe that anymore. He turned to face her completely. What do you believe? Emily took a slow breath. The answer seemed to come from somewhere she had spent years learning how to reach. I think we stopped listening long before we stopped loving. Daniel lowered his eyes. She continued gently. You were always trying to build a future, and you were always trying to protect us. He nodded. I thought if I worked harder. I know. I thought success would make everything easier. Emily smiled sadly. And I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, you would eventually notice I was lonely. Neither accusation nor resentment colored her voice. Only honesty. Only distance earned through healing. Daniel felt every word settle inside him. Not as punishment, as understanding. I didn't see it, he admitted. I know. I kept believing there would always be another weekend. Emily looked toward the sunlight stretching across the street. There usually is. She paused. Until there isn't. The quiet between them deepened. Cars continued passing. People hurried home. Life moved exactly as it always had. Yet for Daniel, the entire afternoon seemed suspended outside of ordinary time. There was something I never told you, he said quietly. Emily waited. After the divorce, I spent years convincing myself I had made the right decision. His voice grew softer. It was easier than admitting I had lost the person who knew me better than anyone. Emily looked at him with unexpected kindness. We both lost something. Another pause. But losing each other wasn't the worst part. Daniel searched her face. The worst part was believing we had failed. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wet leaves through the street. Emily smiled, not because she was remembering the pain, but because she was no longer trapped inside it. I don't think we failed anymore. Daniel frowned. Slightly. No. She shook her head. I think we loved each other the best way we knew how. Her eyes met his. We just weren't wise enough yet. Daniel felt something inside him loosen for the first time in years. Not guilt. Not regret. Something quieter. Acceptance. Frank walked back outside carrying the final paperwork. Everything's finished. Emily accepted the keys with a grateful smile. She looked once more at the nearly invisible mark that had started the entire afternoon. The scratch had disappeared. Neither of them noticed that something else had begun disappearing too. Not the memories. Not the love they once shared. But the weight they had both carried ever since the day they walked away from each other. Some goodbyes do not end a story. They simply become the first honest page of the next chapter. Frank handed Emily the keys with a friendly smile. She's ready to go. Emily thanked him before slipping the keys into her coat pocket. Daniel settled the repair bill before she could protest. You really didn't have to do that, she said. I know. She looked at him. I wanted to. There was nothing more to argue about. Some gestures no longer belonged to obligation. They belonged to gratitude. The afternoon sun had replaced every trace of rain. Water still shimmered on the sidewalks, reflecting patches of blue sky that had been hidden only an hour earlier. Emily opened the driver's door of her SUV. Daniel stood beside his own car, his hand resting lightly on the roof. Neither seemed ready to leave. Finally, Daniel spoke. I've been thinking about something. Emily waited. I don't think I ever apologized. She looked at him quietly. Really apologized. He took a slow breath. When we divorced, I spent so much energy explaining why everything happened. His eyes drifted toward the quiet street. I never stopped long enough to admit how much I had hurt you. Emily remained silent. Not because she wanted him to continue. Because she wanted him to finish in his own time. Daniel's voice became softer. I'm sorry for every evening I came home too late. He smiled sadly. For every conversation I promised we'd have tomorrow. Another pause. 4. Making you feel alone while we were still living under the same roof. The city continued moving around them. Someone laughed across the street. A bicycle rolled past. Life carried on, unaware that two hearts were quietly laying down burdens they had carried for years. Emily looked at him with remarkable gentleness. I accepted your apology a long time ago. Daniel blinked. You did? She nodded. Not because you asked. Because I realized I couldn't keep carrying the anger forever. A breeze lifted a few golden leaves from the curb. They weren't hurting you anymore, she continued. They were only hurting me. Daniel felt his chest tighten. I wish I had known. Emily smiled. You weren't supposed to. She stepped a little closer. There was something I had to learn by myself. He looked at her, listening more carefully than he ever had before. I spent years believing I wasn't enough. She gave a quiet laugh. I thought if I had been more patient, more understanding, less emotional. She gently shook her head. But healing taught me something different. Daniel frowned slightly. What was it? Emily's smile grew warmer. I was never asking for too much. She looked directly into his eyes. I was only asking to be seen. The words settled over both of them like the final notes of a song. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. I see that now. I know. She didn't say it with triumph. She said it with peace. For the first time since the accident, neither of them felt like former husband and wife. They simply felt like two human beings who had finally found the courage to understand the people they used to be. Daniel opened his eyes again. I don't expect another chance. Emily nodded gently. I know. I just wanted you to know that if I could go back. She interrupted him with the smallest shake of her head. We can't. Another quiet smile crossed her face. But we can choose who we become after today. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before smiling back. Not because his regrets had disappeared, because they no longer controlled him. Emily opened her car door and settled behind the wheel. Before closing it, she looked back one final time. Take care of yourself, Daniel. He nodded. You too, Emily. She drove away slowly, disappearing into the warm afternoon light. Daniel remained standing beside his car until the silver SUV vanished beyond the next intersection. Only then did he realize that the apology he had feared for years had not brought him back the woman he once loved. It had given both of them something even more valuable. The freedom to let the past become a memory instead of a prison. Sometimes life waits until both people have finally healed before allowing their paths to cross again. 6 months passed. Autumn quietly returned to Portland, painting the streets with amber leaves and cool morning light. The afternoon of the accident slowly settled into memory, not as a painful reminder, but as a peaceful turning point neither Daniel Brooks nor Emily Harper had expected. Life continued. Daniel still led long meetings, signed contracts, and spent most weekdays inside glass conference rooms overlooking the city skyline. But something about him had changed in ways no promotion could explain. He left work earlier. He answered phone calls instead of promising to return them later. He accepted invitations from old friends he had spent years postponing. Some evenings, he simply walked through the neighborhood with no destination at all, discovering that silence no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like space. Emily's life had changed too. She continued teaching art workshops at the local community center, where children covered their hands with bright paint and believed every blank canvas could become something beautiful. She smiled more easily now, not because every day was perfect, because she had stopped expecting perfection from life. Healing had quietly taught both of them the same lesson through different journeys. Peace rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in ordinary mornings, in deeper breaths, in lighter hearts. One crisp Saturday afternoon, the Portland Museum of Art opened its annual community exhibition. The event celebrated local artists, teachers, volunteers, and young creators whose work reflected everyday life. Emily had helped organize several children's exhibits. She spent the morning adjusting picture frames, arranging flowers, and encouraging nervous young artists before their families arrived. The gallery slowly filled with soft conversations and quiet music. Sunlight poured through tall windows, warming polished wooden floors and white gallery walls covered with paintings full of hope. At nearly the same moment, Daniel entered through the front entrance. A colleague had donated several pieces to the museum fundraiser and invited him to attend. He almost declined. Work had nearly convinced him there wasn't enough time. Then he remembered something Emily had once said years ago. There will always be another meeting. But moments don't wait. So he came. He wandered slowly through the exhibition, stopping longer than expected before paintings created by elementary school students. One canvas showed 2 trees standing side by side through every season. Another showed a cracked flower pot with bright flowers blooming anyway. Daniel smiled. Children had a remarkable way of painting truth without trying. As he turned the corner into another gallery, he noticed someone adjusting a small name card beneath a watercolor landscape. She stood with her back toward him. Blonde hair rested gently against the collar of her navy sweater. She stepped back to examine the painting before turning around. Their eyes met. Neither looked surprised this time. Instead, both smiled almost immediately. The distance between them felt completely different from 6 months earlier. No hesitation. No unfinished apologies. Only quiet recognition. Emily walked toward him. I had a feeling we'd meet again someday. Daniel laughed softly. So did I. She looked around the gallery. I just didn't think it would be here. Neither did I. For a moment, they stood surrounded by paintings, laughter, and strangers who knew nothing about the story hidden behind two simple smiles. There was no awkwardness. No need to explain the past. The accident had introduced them once again. Time had transformed them into people capable of appreciating the gift it had given. Without realizing it, both of them had arrived at the same place. Not back where they had once been, but somewhere gentler, somewhere wiser, somewhere two hearts could finally meet without carrying the weight they once mistook for love. Fate had never been waiting beside the damaged bumper. It had been waiting for two hearts to become the people they were always meant to be. The museum gradually emptied as the afternoon faded into evening. Parents carried sleepy children toward the exit, volunteers folded programs, and the last notes of the string quartet drifted softly through the bright gallery. Daniel and Emily remained near the watercolor landscape she had been adjusting when they first saw each other again. Neither of them seemed to notice how much time had passed. Emily smiled as she looked around the room. I love this part. The end of the day? She nodded. After everyone leaves. Daniel glanced across the quiet gallery. It feels different. It reminds me that beautiful things don't disappear when people stop looking at them. He understood she wasn't talking about paintings. They slowly walked toward the museum garden, where rows of maple trees overlooked the Willamette River. The evening sun stretched long ribbons of gold across the water. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer needed protection. It had become a place where both of them could breathe. Daniel finally broke it. Can I ask you something? Emily smiled. You just did. He laughed, and so did she. The sound felt wonderfully familiar. If we hadn't met again because of that accident. He paused. Do you think we would still have become these people? Emily considered the question carefully. I think life would have taught us eventually. She watched a single leaf drift onto the river below. But maybe not as gently. Daniel nodded. I used to believe fate changed our lives through big moments. Emily looked toward him. And now, I think it changes us through small ones. He smiled. A delayed conversation. A cup of coffee. A scratched bumper. Emily laughed softly. Who would have imagined? They stood together as evening settled over the city. There was no dramatic confession. No promise to begin again. No desperate attempt to rewrite what had already been lived. Because some endings deserve respect. And some new beginnings do not need names. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the old photograph that had fallen from his trunk months earlier. The edges were still worn. The colors had faded slightly. He looked at it one last time. Then he handed it to Emily. I think this belongs to both of us. She accepted it carefully. For several quiet seconds, she studied the younger versions of themselves laughing beside the lake. So much hope, she whispered. So much innocence. Daniel smiled. They helped us become who we are. Emily nodded. They did. She slipped the photograph back into his hand. No. He looked confused. You keep it. She smiled with complete certainty. I don't need a photograph anymore. He frowned slightly. Why not? Emily looked directly into his eyes. Because I've already kept everything worth remembering. Daniel felt tears gather, not from sadness, but from gratitude. He folded the photograph and returned it to his pocket. Not as something to mourn, as something to honor. The museum lights slowly illuminated behind them as twilight covered the garden. People often believe that fate is about bringing two people back together. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes fate simply gives us one final opportunity to say the words we were not ready to speak years ago. To forgive without forgetting. To remember without suffering. To walk away without resentment. Daniel and Emily eventually reached the parking lot. They hugged briefly. Not as husband and wife. Not as former lovers. As two old friends whose lives had forever shaped one another. Then they walked toward separate cars. Separate roads. Separate futures. Neither looked back. They didn't need to. Because this time, nothing important had been left behind. Sometimes the greatest love story is not about finding your way back to each other. It is about finding your way back to yourself. And on an ordinary afternoon that had begun with a scratched bumper, fate had quietly given Daniel Brooks and Emily Harper exactly that. Not another marriage. Not another chance. Something far rarer. Peace.